What would you do if the person on trial was your childhood friend? When Judge Eleanor Lockhart recognizes the accused, James Anderson, her world is turned upside down. Is he guilty, or has the system failed him? What happens next will challenge everything you believe about justice and humanity. The courtroom buzzed with the usual rhythm of activity, attorneys organizing their notes, quiet conversations rippling through the gallery, and the distant thud of a gavel echoing from another trial. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat poised at the bench, her demeanor calm and composed. To her, it seemed like just another day, just another case, or so it appeared. The bailiff's voice broke through the air. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted in her chair, her hands resting on the smooth surface of the bench as she scanned the case file in front of her. Charges of assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. A familiar pang of disappointment tugged at her heart. Another troubled soul lost in the maze of the system, she thought. But when the defendant stepped into the courtroom, shackled and subdued, her world shifted. The man before her wasn't a stranger. He was James Anderson. Her James. Her breath caught as a torrent of memories flooded her mind. She could almost feel the summer heat of their childhood, their laughter echoing as they raced bicycles down dirt roads in Hammond, Louisiana. She saw the magnolia tree in her backyard, where they whispered dreams under a canopy of stars. She remembered the promises they made to stand by each other, no matter what. Yet the man standing before her was a shadow of the boy she once knew. His shoulders slumped under the weight of life, his face etched with years of struggle. But those eyes, deep and familiar, were unmistakable. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the gavel, her composure faltering for the first time in her career. James glanced up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Recognition flickered between them, but he quickly dropped his gaze, his shoulders sagging further. The courtroom stilled, an unspoken tension filling the space. Clearing her throat, Eleanor forced herself to push past the storm raging inside her. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of something deeply personal. "Mr. Anderson," she began, "you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was low, rough, and heavy with resignation. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words hung in the air as Eleanor struggled to balance the roles of judge and a woman revisiting the ghost of a past she thought she'd left behind. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began their opening statements, Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just any case, this was James. And somehow she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Eleanor's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana, divided not by distance but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while James's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met. An accidental encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She'd offered to help, and that simple gesture had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Eleanor," he had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, "you ever think about leaving this place? Like really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and the outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then one day it all ended. It was the summer before high school when Eleanor's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Eleanor, get inside. Now." She'd hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from going near James, and soon after, James's family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into school, her ambitions carrying her far beyond the town of Hammond. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of James after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, nothing that screamed a violent nature. But then again, how much of someone's life could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. James was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. James was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor studied James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Eleanor a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant, Margaret, approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Hayes, are you okay?" "You seemed a little distracted," Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Powell, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice firm, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register's contents. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if James were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at James, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. "If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time." The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story, and that assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand, a store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. He described seeing a man fitting James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. Lisa's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly. "So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no, but no further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring as if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was James, but the quality made it difficult to discern any identifying features. As the video played, Eleanor studied it intently. Could this truly be James? The figure moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. James's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate James's innocence, but the jury's expressions hinted at skepticism. As the trial wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness. But how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to James, to ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case in her career. As she watched James being escorted out of the room in shackles, Eleanor's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to reveal the truth. But for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial reached a pivotal moment. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Lisa Porter called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Harris, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Lisa approached him with deliberate calm. Officer Harris, she began, you were the one who apprehended my client, correct? That's right, he replied, his tone clipped. You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct? Yes. And what led you to believe he was the suspect? Harris shifted in his seat. He matched the description. A black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. Lisa's eyebrows raised slightly. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession when you searched him? Harris hesitated. No, but he could have discarded it. Lisa took a step closer. Could have. Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate the supposed hoodie? Harris's jaw tightened. No, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly. Lisa pressed on. So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description, without physical evidence linking him to the scene. The officer's silence spoke louder than any words. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain glances. Lisa wasn't done. Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Anderson said anything at the time of his arrest? He protested, said he was innocent. And did you consider investigating his claim? Or did you assume guilt based solely on his appearance? Harris's face reddened. I followed protocol. Protocol, Lisa repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom buzzed again as Harris stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was more than just a trial, now it was a reckoning. Not just for James, but for a system that seemed too eager to condemn him. The defense's next move was unexpected. Lisa introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that based on the height and build of the individual in the video, there was no definitive way to confirm it was James. Furthermore, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising questions about its reliability. The prosecutor attempted to dismiss the testimony as conjecture, but the jury appeared unsettled. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Eleanor could feel its weight. As the trial neared its end, James took the stand against Lisa's advice, determined to speak his truth. Chains clinked softly as he approached, his voice steady but filled with raw sincerity. I've made mistakes, he began, facing the jury. But I didn't do this. That night I was walking home when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask, they decided I fit the bill. My whole life I've been fighting to be seen as more than assumptions. I just want the truth to matter. His words hung in the air. A plea not just for justice, but for dignity. Eleanor's chest tightened, her impartial facade betraying the emotional weight of his testimony. The final day arrived, tense with anticipation. Closing arguments painted opposing pictures. The prosecutor leaned on circumstantial evidence, while Lisa urged the jury to look deeper, to see the flaws in the case and James's humanity. After hours of deliberation, the jury remained out. James sat silently, hands clasped, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. She understood why. What could she possibly say? The truth wasn't just in their hands, it was a fight against prejudice, and the burden of justice weighed heavier than ever. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel, restoring order. James's shoulders sagged as if a weight had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear this victory came at a cost. Eleanor addressed the court, her voice steady. The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, watching James as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly empty now. Just a few clerks tidying up and Margaret gathering files. James stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly, but I'd like to know why. Why didn't you say anything? You knew me. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, the words catching. Because I couldn't. I had to be fair. If I'd said something, it might have jeopardized the case. James studied her, his face a mix of hurt and understanding. Fair, he repeated. That's the thing, Eleanor. The world's never been fair, not for people like me. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "And I'm sorry." James gave a quiet nod before turning and walking away, his posture firm as he vanished through the courthouse doors. Alone in the empty courtroom, Eleanor sat, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her. She had followed the law, but the trial had uncovered a deeper reality. Justice wasn't simply about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives impacted by systems that extended far beyond one individual. For Eleanor, it was a moment of clarity, a reminder that her role wasn't just one of authority, but one with the potential for change. As she left the courthouse that evening, the sinking sun casting long shadows over the steps, she made an unspoken promise to herself. She couldn't undo the past, but she would strive to ensure the future held more than empty notions of justice. It would be challenging, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to James and to herself to make the effort.